The photograph had survived for nearly a century and a half, tucked away in an archive drawer, its edges softened by time and careless handling. At first glance, it was unremarkable. A father seated between his twin daughters, all three dressed in their finest, faces fixed in the formal calm demanded by long exposure and social expectation. The twins stood close, identical down to the ribbon knots at their collars, their expressions faintly pleasant, as if caught mid-thought. The father's hand rested gently on each of their shoulders, a picture of balance and quiet pride. Nothing about it suggested sorrow. Nothing warned the viewer to look away. It was only when the restoration began, when dust, scratches, and chemical decay were carefully stripped from the image, that unease crept in. The clarity sharpened too much. Lines once blurred by age grew precise, and in that precision, the photograph seemed to resist being seen. The twins' faces no longer appeared perfectly alike. One smiled with her eyes, the other did not. One stood firmly grounded. The other seemed slightly misaligned, as though she had been placed there after the fact. The longer the image remained on the screen, the more the air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as if the past itself were leaning forward, waiting. The father's expression changed the most. What had once read as calm authority now resembled restraint. His jaw was clenched, not from patience, but from fear. His fingers pressed into fabric and flesh with subtle urgency, as though he were afraid that if he loosened his grip, something irreversible would happen. And then there were the eyes, his eyes, focused not on the camera, but on something just beyond it, something unseen, something that did not belong in a family portrait. By the time the restoration was complete, the happiness the photograph once promised had vanished entirely. In its place lingered a quiet, devastating realization. This image was never meant to preserve a joyful moment. It was an act of denial, frozen in silver and shadow, a desperate attempt to hold on to what had already slipped beyond the boundaries of life. In 1885, the camera was not a device for spontaneity, but for performance. To be photographed was to agree to stillness, to discipline the body and the face into something acceptable, something worth preserving. The photograph of the father and his twin daughters conforms perfectly to this expectation. At first glance, it offers everything a Victorian family portrait was meant to convey: order, propriety, and quiet contentment. The father sits centered, shoulders squared, dressed in a dark, well-kept suit that signals stability and respectability. His posture communicates authority without aggression, suggesting a man in control of his household and proud of the life he has constructed. Nothing about his presence hints at chaos or fracture. The twin girls flank him with near-perfect symmetry, a visual balance that immediately reassures the viewer. Their dresses are identical, carefully pressed, their hair parted and tied with matching ribbons, reinforcing the idea of harmony and innocence. In an era obsessed with appearances, twins symbolized continuity and blessing, two lives mirroring each other, doubling hope rather than fear. Their expressions are soft, neither joyful nor distressed, shaped by the long exposure times that discouraged overt emotion. To modern eyes, their calm might seem eerie, but within the context of the time, it reads as obedience and good upbringing. They appear healthy, present, and very much alive. The composition itself works quietly to eliminate suspicion. The father's hands rest gently on their shoulders, a gesture that feels protective, anchoring, and affectionate. It frames the children as his responsibility and his legacy, binding them to him in a way that feels both literal and symbolic. The background is plain, offering no distractions, no shadows deep enough to suggest secrets. The lighting is even, flattering, intentionally unchallenging. Everything in the image guides the observer toward a single conclusion: This is a stable family, captured in a moment of quiet dignity. Because of this, the photograph disarms the viewer. It does not ask to be questioned. It does not invite scrutiny beyond surface-level observation. It operates on cultural familiarity, leaning on the visual language of its time to project safety and normalcy. The smiles, though restrained, feel sincere enough. The symmetry feels comforting. The stillness feels respectful. It is precisely this ordinariness that becomes its greatest deception. The image offers reassurance before curiosity has a chance to form, convincing the viewer that there is nothing more to see, nothing hidden between the fixed gazes and carefully arranged bodies, nothing tragic waiting beneath the polished illusion of happiness. The restoration process began as a technical exercise, not an emotional one. The photograph was scanned at high resolution, every crack, stain, and faded edge captured with clinical precision. At first, the image appeared exactly as expected, its age-worn surface confirming nothing more than the passage of time. The goal was simple: remove the noise introduced by decades of neglect and chemical decay. Return the photograph to something closer, to what the original lens had seen. Dust was lifted away pixel by pixel, scratches softened, discoloration corrected. With each adjustment, the figures in the image became sharper, more defined, more present. It was during this gradual clarification that something felt wrong. The cleaner the image became, the less cooperative it seemed. Areas that should have resolved into clarity instead revealed irregularities. Subtle distortions that did not align with known flaws of early photography. Shadows behaved strangely, deepening where light should have erased them. The texture of the twins' dresses, once blurred into uniformity, showed inconsistencies that suggested movement where none should exist. The more the software corrected the damage, the more the photograph resisted being perfected, as though it were shedding a deliberate disguise. Facial details emerged next, and with them a quiet sense of unease. The girl's features sharpened unevenly, one face gaining definition faster than the other, as if the image itself favored one presence over the other. Fine lines around the eyes appeared, where age alone could not explain them, and the direction of their gazes, once assumed to be straight ahead, subtly diverged. These were not dramatic revelations, not the kind that demanded immediate alarm, but small enough to provoke doubt, to make the restorer pause and look again. Even the father's figure changed under scrutiny. His suit darkened in places where it should have remained uniform, folds deepening unnaturally, as though shadow had been layered on after the moment was captured. His hands, once gentle in their placement, appeared tense when sharpened, the pressure of his grip more apparent in the fabric beneath his fingers. The restoration did not add these details. It merely removed what had been hiding them. The image was not becoming something new, but something more honest. What unsettled most was the realization that these discoveries were not the result of interpretation, but of visibility. Nothing had been altered creatively, nothing invented. Each unsettling detail had always existed, buried beneath the photograph's decay and the viewer's expectations. The restoration functioned like a slow lifting of a veil, revealing not a single shocking flaw, but a collection of quiet abnormalities that, together, changed the meaning of the image entirely. What once felt complete now felt compromised, and what had seemed like harmless wear from time began to resemble deliberate concealment, as if the photograph had been waiting for the moment when it could no longer hide what it truly contained. The restored image lingered on the screen. Attention shifted inevitably to the twins, whose apparent sameness had once been the photograph's most reassuring feature. At first, the differences between them were easy to dismiss as imperfections in the process. minor variations introduced by lighting, age, or the original exposure. But the longer one looked, the harder it became to ignore the growing sense that the symmetry was an illusion carefully maintained by distance and decay. With clarity restored, the twins no longer mirrored each other as perfectly as memory had suggested. Their faces, once assumed identical, began to separate into distinct presences. One girl's expression carried a softness that read as awareness, her eyes reflecting light with a natural depth, pupils clearly defined. The other's gaze felt flatter, less responsive, as though it did not fully engage with the camera or the world beyond it. The angle of her head differed by only a fraction, yet it was enough to disturb the balance of the image, creating the impression that she was slightly out of alignment with her surroundings. This was not the kind of difference caused by impatience or fatigue. During a long exposure, it felt more fundamental, more deliberate. The discrepancy extended beyond their faces into the physical space they occupied. One twin's shoes pressed firmly into the floor, grounding her within the scene. The other seemed to hover just enough to raise doubt, her feet lacking the same clarity, the contact with the ground uncertain. Shadows reinforced this unease. Where one child cast a consistent, predictable shadow, the others appeared faint, broken, or delayed, as if it belonged to a different moment entirely. These were not dramatic absences, but subtle failures of cohesion, the kind the eye notices before the mind can explain. Their clothing, identical by design, betrayed similar inconsistencies. Creases in the fabric aligned cleanly on one dress, following the natural fall of the body beneath. On the other, the folds behaved strangely, ignoring gravity, flattening where depth should have been visible. It was as though the material was not responding to a solid form in the same way. These small details accumulated quietly, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern that resisted rationalization. What made the realization unsettling was not the differences themselves, but what they implied. Twins are expected to share space seamlessly, to echo each other's presence. Here one did. The other merely occupied the shape of a child, convincingly enough to pass at a glance, but lacking the full weight of reality. The photograph had not captured two identical lives frozen in time, but something closer to a comparison, a silent contrast between what belonged in the frame and what had been forced to remain there, with the twins no longer reading as equal presences. The father's role in the photograph demanded a second, more uncomfortable examination. What had once seemed like the stable center of the composition began to feel less like an anchor and more like a barrier. His posture, previously interpreted as composed and dignified, revealed a rigidity that went beyond formality. His back was unnaturally straight, his shoulders locked in place, as though he were bracing himself rather than simply sitting for a portrait. This was not the relaxed stillness of a man at ease, but the controlled stillness of someone holding something together through effort alone. The placement of his hands became impossible to dismiss. They did not rest, they pressed. The fabric beneath his fingers pulled tight, bunching slightly, suggesting tension rather than comfort. On one shoulder, his grip appeared firmer. The thumb angled inward in a way that implied restraint. It was the subtle difference between guiding and preventing, between affection and necessity. When viewed alongside the growing imbalance between the twins, his touch felt less like reassurance and more like containment, as though he were afraid that without his intervention, something would slip out of place. His face, too, carried a weight that had been overlooked. The set of his mouth was severe, not stern but restrained, as if words had been deliberately swallowed. Fine lines around his eyes, once dismissed as signs of age, now suggested prolonged strain. His gaze did not meet the camera directly. Instead, it hovered slightly to the side, focused on a point that seemed unrelated to the act of being photographed. It was the look of someone distracted by a thought too urgent to ignore, even in a moment meant to be preserved. The father's position between the girls took on a different meaning as well. Rather than symbolizing unity, it began to resemble division. He was not merely seated among them, he was separating them, maintaining a boundary that felt intentional. The space between the twins was not equal, one standing marginally closer, the other subtly edged away. His body language suggested an instinct to shield one child, while simultaneously keeping the other in place, as if both actions were equally necessary. This reframing transformed him from a passive subject into an active participant in whatever truth the photograph concealed. His presence no longer communicated pride or protection alone, but responsibility layered with guilt. He looked like a man aware that the image being captured was not an honest reflection of reality, yet determined to preserve it anyway, clinging to the illusion long enough to trap it in silver and shadow. The final realization did not arrive suddenly or with spectacle. It settled slowly, with the weight of something that had always been true, but carefully avoided. When all the visual inconsistencies were considered together, the uneven presence of the twins, the father's strained restraint, the photograph's resistance to clarity, the image could no longer be read as a simple family portrait. It began to resemble a constructed moment, one designed not to celebrate life, but to deny loss. The photograph was not capturing what was happening, but what the father wished were still possible. Historical context deepened the implication. In the late 19th century, photography was often used as a final act of remembrance. Death moved quickly through households, especially among children, and mourning rituals adapted to the limitations of the time. Families documented what they could not keep, arranging bodies carefully, dressing them in familiar clothes, posing them among the living to soften the finality of absence. When viewed through this lens, the photograph's strange qualities aligned too well to be coincidence. One twin did not merely appear different, she appeared preserved. The inconsistencies in her presence suggested not deception by technology, but by intention. Her unnatural stillness, the failure of shadow, the resistance of fabric to behave like it was draped over living form, all pointed toward a truth that was emotionally unbearable, yet visually undeniable. The father's grip was no longer a mystery. It was practical. He was holding a body upright, anchoring it long enough for the exposure to complete, long enough to create the illusion that both his daughters still shared the same moment in time. What made the image tragic was not the act itself, but the reason behind it. This was not spectacle or exploitation. It was grief refusing to accept sequence. The photograph attempted to collapse before and after into a single frame, erasing the boundary between life and death through careful positioning and hope disguised as composure. The living twin stood beside her sister not as a subject, but as a witness, her subtle vitality unintentionally highlighting what had already been lost. The photograph, once restored, no longer functioned as a record of happiness. It revealed itself as a negotiation with reality, a final compromise between acceptance and denial. The father's expression carried the knowledge that this moment was false, but necessary. The image was never meant for strangers or scrutiny. It was meant to reassure the family that, for one frozen instant, nothing had changed. In preserving that illusion, the photograph also preserved the grief embedded within it, waiting patiently for a future eye to notice that one of the smiles was never truly alive,